Welcome to the Deep Dive. Ready to break down today's news?
Let's dive in.
All right, let's start with those LA wildfires. They've really sparked a debate about fire safety. The LA Times is saying lawmakers are pushing for these ember-resistant zones around homes. What exactly are those?
Well, they're basically buffer zones, around homes, using fire-resistant landscaping, building materials, that kind of thing. The idea is to keep embers from igniting those homes, even if the fire's far away.
So it's about more than just putting out the fire, it's preventing it from spreading in the first place.
Exactly. Proactive approach. Got to acknowledge that wildfires are just part of life here in California. We want to make these communities more resilient to them.
Makes you wonder if other fire-prone areas could use this model, especially with similar risks. Now, California is pushing for greener transportation, but there's a snag with electric vehicles, right? The LA Times mentioned that the state mandate for electric trucks hit a wall at the federal level.
Yeah, basically, the federal government rejected California's request to do their own electric truck mandate. Brings up an interesting point, right? Balance between state and federal power when it comes to environmental regulations.
So even though California is known for setting its own stricter standards, this might be a sign that there are limits.
Maybe so.
Okay. So it's a reminder of how complex the politics are surrounding climate change. Makes you wonder about the challenges of getting meaningful policies enacted. But despite this setback, California is pushing ahead.
Oh, for sure.
The LA Times mentioned state-level subsidies and regulations to encourage zero-emission trucks.
Shows how committed they are to their climate goals, even if they have to work around the feds. Makes you think, how can we all support initiatives that reflect our values even when they face resistance?
Another big topic in California: water. Governor Newsom issued an order to grab as much water as possible during these storms, but the LA Times says it's causing a stir.
Yeah, some critics are even comparing it to some of Trump's, more controversial moves.
Comparing it to Trump, wow.
Might be a bit of a stretch, but there are definitely concerns about the environmental impact if we focus too much on storing water. Could mess with the natural ecosystems, harm fish.
So balancing water scarcity with not hurting the environment. Always a tightrope walk.
It is. It's a classic example of how tricky it can be for policymakers to deal with environmental problems. There's rarely a simple solution, and you're often weighing different needs and potential trade-offs.
And speaking of balancing, the LA Times had a really uplifting story about saving nearly 300 trout from the Palisades fire burn scar.
Oh, yeah. Great example of how to be proactive with conservation. You see, biologists know the first rain after a fire is dangerous for fish. The mud and debris wash into the streams and they suffocate. They got those rare steelhead trout out just in time.
Goes to show that those wildfires have lasting effects, even beyond the immediate damage. We have to consider the impact on ecosystems and the wildlife.
Absolutely.
And while we're talking about animals, we can't forget those stories about those chickens, cats, dogs, even a goldfish that survived the LA fires.
I know, right? Unbelievable resilience in the face of all that destruction. Gives you hope.
It does. Shows our connection with animals, how they can inspire us even when things are tough. Okay, time to talk about something less fun, also a climate change result.
What's that?
Rats. Both the LA Times and NPR highlighted how those warmer winters are causing urban rat populations to explode.
Yeah, warmer temps mean they can breed year-round, survive winters that would normally keep their numbers down. Public health issue too, They spread disease and can really damage property.
Climate change has consequences for everyone, even in the city.
It does. And if those warmer temperatures are impacting something as adaptable as rats, what else are we missing? Really makes you think about the broader implications of a changing climate.
Makes you wonder, right? Now for some good news. While California's snowpack is below average for this time of year, according to the LA Times, things could change.
How so?
Major storms are predicted to hit California, could bring that much-needed snow to the mountains.
That's great news. We need that healthy snowpack for California's water supply, acts as a natural reservoir.
Fingers crossed for a snowy winter. Now let's move on to some political news.
Sounds good.
The LA Times reported that federal officials opened up 2 California dams, following an order from, former President Trump. This is causing controversy, some worried about the environmental impact. What are the main concerns?
Well, mainly that releasing water from the dams could harm endangered salmon. They depend on those rivers to spawn. Plus, there's the impact on downstream ecosystems and the potential for higher salinity in the San Francisco Bay Delta.
Shows how even water management, something that seems straightforward, can get caught up in environmental and political issues.
Definitely. Highlights the importance of looking at the big picture when making decisions about our natural resources. We got to consider not just the immediate benefits, but also the long-term effects on the environment and the communities that rely on it.
Speaking of former President Trump, NPR reported that he's made it clear he's sticking with fossil fuels. How will this impact U.S. climate policy?
Well, this goes against the previous administration's focus on renewable energy and climate action. Likely means we'll see a rollback of environmental regulations, more investment in fossil fuel infrastructure, and a weaker commitment to those international climate agreements.
This shift in policy is going to be a big topic of discussion and could have major consequences for the future of climate action in the U.S.
It will. And it really underlines that political divide we see on climate change, how hard it is to agree on solutions. We'll probably keep seeing that struggle between economic growth and environmental protection.
Climate change isn't just science, it's political too. Now let's take a break from politics and look at some cool science news. I was reading about a study on how insects are adapting to climate change.
Oh, the one from Science Daily.
Yeah, that's the one.
Some pretty surprising results,
Yep.
Some insect species are actually getting bigger because of the warmer temperatures, while others are getting smaller.
Really? I had no idea climate change could have such varied effects on insects. What's causing that?
I think it has to do with changes in metabolism and development. Warmer temperatures speed things up, sometimes leading to smaller body sizes. But sometimes they've got more food available because the growing seasons are longer, and that makes them bigger.
Nature is so complex, we're only beginning to understand how climate change will impact different species.
Right, and that's why we need more research, helps us predict and adapt to these changes. The more we know about how species are responding to climate change, the better we can manage these ecosystems and preserve biodiversity.
And speaking of discoveries, Science Daily also had good news about lithium-ion battery recycling.
Oh yeah, huge development. Those batteries are crucial for electric vehicles and storing renewable energy, but recycling them is tough, inefficient, and not very environmentally friendly right now.
So what's different about this research?
They figured out a new way to do it. More efficient, less pollution. It's about extracting valuable metals from the batteries without using harsh chemicals. This could really change the environmental impact of battery production and make electric vehicles even more sustainable.
That's a win-win for the environment and the economy. Another interesting study I read about shed light on how the atmosphere affects ocean weather.
Ah, that one from Science Daily used satellite imagery and climate model data to show how atmospheric winds influence ocean eddies.
And those eddies play a vital role in transporting heat, nutrients, and marine organisms throughout the ocean, right?
Right. So this research helps us understand that complex relationship between the atmosphere and the oceans. And that's important because
Because the oceans control our climate. And changes in ocean circulation can really mess things up, from weather patterns to sea levels to marine life.
exactly, it's all connected. You can't look at one thing in isolation. We need to think holistically to come up with effective solutions to climate change.
That's a great point. And speaking of solutions, Science Daily also had a piece on constructed wetlands, saying they're really good at capturing carbon in those early years.
They are. Those wetlands are amazing. They're basically man-made systems that work like natural wetlands, filtering out pollutants from water and sucking up CO2 from the air. They're often used for treating wastewater and stormwater runoff.
So they're a natural solution to both pollution and climate change.
You got it. But here's the thing. The study found that as they mature, they get less effective at capturing carbon. So they're a good tool, but not a forever solution to climate change.
Shows how we need to use all the tools we have, natural and technological, to effectively address climate change.
I agree. No magic bullet, but if we combine our approaches, we can make real progress towards a more sustainable future. Now, let's see what the conversation has to offer.
All right, what did you find over there?
Came across this article about lake beds being like time capsules.
Time capsules, that's interesting.
Yeah, it's because over time, lake beds accumulate layers of sediment, and those layers can tell you a lot about past environmental conditions. Scientists study pollen, fossils, and the chemical composition of the sediment to basically reconstruct past climates, vegetation changes, and even human impacts.
So it's like a window to the past, helping us understand how ecosystems have changed over time.
Exactly. That info can be really helpful for figuring out the long-term impacts of climate change and guide our conservation efforts. By learning from the past, we can understand what might happen in the future. Now for a less cheerful story. The conversation also reported on those terrible floods in North Queensland, Australia.
Yeah, I saw that too. Intense rain and flooding caused a lot of damage and displacement. What are the main things we should take away from this event?
Well, it really shows that extreme weather events, fueled by climate change, are becoming more frequent and intense. The article stressed the need for better disaster preparedness and making our infrastructure more resilient, especially in those vulnerable coastal areas.
Climate change is already having a big impact on the world, and we need to take action to minimize the damage.
We do. Now let's dive into some in-depth reporting from Inside Climate News.
Okay, what stood out to you?
This article about a conflict over water rights in Wyoming shows the growing tension between indigenous tribes and others over who gets access to water, especially with climate change in the mix.
Water scarcity always leads to complicated social and political challenges. We need solutions that are fair and respect everyone's rights.
Right. It's going to be a bigger and bigger problem as climate change increases water stress around the world. And here's another interesting piece from Inside Climate News that caught my eye.
What's that one about?
It looked at a study suggesting that living near active oil and gas wells might increase the risk of dying from COVID-19.
Really?
Yeah, they found a link between how close people live to those wells and higher COVID-19 death rates.
That's worrying. What's the connection there?
The study suggests that air pollution from the oil and gas wells might be making people more vulnerable to respiratory illnesses, which would include COVID-19. And it highlights the potential health risks of living near industrial sites, especially for people who are already vulnerable.
Reminds us that environmental health is tied to human health, and we need to think about those impacts when we're making decisions about industrial development. Now let's move to a more positive story. I read about efforts to protect wetlands in New York. The Staten Island Project, right, trying to create a mitigation bank for wetlands.
That's the one.
Basically, they want to restore or create new wetlands to make up for wetlands lost due to development.
Wetlands are so important, filtering water, protecting shorelines, providing habitats for wildlife.
Exactly. With a mitigation bank, developers can offset the impact of their projects while still protecting these vital ecosystems.
Great example of balancing development with environmental protection. So what's happening in Vermont? Well, Inside Climate News reported that a key climate policy there is facing pushback from some lawmakers. Shows how hard it is to get those ambitious climate policies passed and implemented, even in places that are usually supportive of climate action.
Even in places like Vermont.
Even there.
Progress on climate change is fragile, depends on who's in power, takes a lot of effort and political will to create real change.
It does. Speaking of challenges in the clean energy transition, Inside Climate News reported on a battery fire at that large battery energy storage plant in Moss Landing, California.
Yeah, what happened there?
They didn't go into detail about the cause, but it shows we need to be careful about safety as we build more battery energy storage systems. Those systems are key for using renewable energy on the grid, but we have to make sure they're safe.
As we switch to cleaner energy, we still have to be aware of potential risks and make sure we have safety measures in place.
Absolutely. Gotta weigh the good and the bad with any new technology.
Let's go south to South Carolina now. Inside Climate News reported about their huge potential for solar energy.
It's true, they've got plenty of sunshine and available land, perfect spot for solar farms. The article talked about the economic benefits of solar energy, creating jobs and getting away from fossil fuels.
It's great to see states recognizing the benefits of solar power. Now, over to Chicago, what's happening there?
Well, despite threats to federal funding, they're sticking with their climate goals.
That's encouraging.
It is. Shows how committed many cities and states are to tackling climate change, even if the federal government isn't doing much.
It's a testament to the power of local action and how many people recognize that climate change needs our attention now.
Right, and it shows how important leadership is at every level of government. When national governments don't act, cities and states need to step up.
Now, for a story that shows how climate change affects real people, Inside Climate News shared stories of formerly incarcerated firefighters in California.
Yeah, one man's story really stood out, the challenges he faced coming back into society while battling those wildfires. It reminds us that those most impacted by climate change are often those who are already facing challenges.
We have to make sure our climate solutions are fair and take care of the people who are most affected by climate change.
Absolutely. Climate justice means everyone has what they need to adapt to these changes.
What's happening at the Department of Transportation?
Inside Climate News said the new head of the DOT is getting rid of a lot of climate-related programs.
Oh, wow, that's a big change. What's the thinking behind that?
Sounds like the new administration is putting deregulation and economic growth ahead of the environment. Could have a big impact on transportation. Fuel efficiency standards, public transportation, reducing greenhouse gas emissions from vehicles.
A step backward for climate action, and a reminder that politics can really affect our environmental progress.
It can. And it highlights how important it is to keep an eye on things and advocate for climate-friendly policies. Sometimes we forget about the little things that can impact climate change.
Like what?
Road salt.
Road salt.
Yeah, Inside Climate News explained how it's essential for road safety during the winter, but can be bad for water quality and ecosystems. When it washes off the roads, it pollutes rivers and lakes, harms aquatic life, and could even affect drinking water.
We often don't think about how even the little things we do can affect the environment.
We don't, and it shows how important it is to find sustainable alternatives. The article talked about research into things like beet juice and cheese brine, less harmful de-icers.
Interesting. Now let's go beyond our planet. NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory has an article about a new space telescope called SphereX.
Oh yes, SphereX is going to map the whole sky using infrared light that'll give us valuable data about the early universe, how galaxies form, and what those distant stars and planets are made of.
Space exploration is so exciting. Think of all the new things we'll discover as we explore the universe.
I know. Plus, all that space exploration leads to new technology that can help us here on Earth.
Bringing it back down to Earth, JPL also published an article about how NASA's radar imagery is being used to study landslides in the LA area.
That's a good use of technology. It can help us figure out what causes those landslides and identify areas at risk. That information can be used to create early warning systems and reduce the risks of those potentially deadly events.
A great example of how space technology can solve real-world problems.
Definitely shows how science and technology are connected, and how important it is to keep investing in research and development to solve those big problems facing society.
What's happening over at Climate Solutions?
They put out an action alert, urging people to contact their representatives and support community resilience hubs. Those hubs provide essential services and support during emergencies, especially the ones made worse by climate change.
So they're a vital part of preparing for the impacts of climate change, right? Things like cooling centers during heat waves, shelter during floods, food and water when the power goes out.
Exactly. Plus, they can also be community gathering spaces, even when there isn't an emergency. Helps build those social connections and creates a sense of responsibility for being prepared and resilient.
It's not just about reducing emissions. It's about being ready for what's already happening and making sure communities have the resources they need to handle it.
Right on.
NASA's Earth Observatory shared a striking image of Tampa Bay.
Beautiful, isn't it?
It is. They highlighted the importance of protecting that vital estuary from climate change.
Estuaries are so important. Those ecosystems are teeming with life. They filter water and protect shorelines.
Our planet's ecosystems are amazing, but so fragile. We need to protect them for the future.
Couldn't agree more.
But then Earth Observatory also shared this image of Alaska, showing how little snow they have this winter because of those warmer temperatures.
It's shocking. You see brown mountains where there should be snow. Really shows you how climate change is impacting even the far corners of the planet, and those changes affect us all.
The Arctic is changing so fast, and that has consequences for everyone. Melting glaciers and ice sheets lead to rising sea levels, threatening coastal communities everywhere.
Plus, it disrupts those fragile ecosystems and impacts indigenous communities who depend on that land and ice.
The Indigenous Climate Hub shared a really thought-provoking reflection on the impact of climate change on indigenous communities.
They talked about that deep connection between indigenous people and the land, and how climate change is harming that relationship, threatening their cultural heritage, traditional ways of life, and even their spiritual well-being.
The author used this metaphor of small berries, which are culturally and nutritionally important to many indigenous communities, to show that delicate balance of nature and how climate change is messing it up.
It was a really powerful piece.
Climate change isn't just an environmental issue, it's a social justice issue that hits marginalized communities hardest, even though they're the least responsible for the problem.
So true. We need to listen to those most affected by climate change and include their knowledge and perspectives in our solutions.
Let's switch gears to a different viewpoint on climate change. Climate Change Dispatch had an article criticizing a study that predicted millions of heat-related deaths in Europe.
What was their reasoning?
They said the study used faulty data and exaggerated the situation, leading to those inflated predictions. They argue that it didn't take into account things like adaptation measures, new technology, and socioeconomic changes that could lessen the impact of heat waves.
Shows how even scientists disagree about the severity and effects of climate change. It's crucial to critically evaluate scientific findings and look at different points of view.
Especially with complex issues like climate change, where there's a lot of uncertainty and conflicting information.
Right, and we need to be careful about sensationalist reporting that scares people without presenting a balanced or accurate view. Climate change is a serious threat, but we need to be level-headed and rely on evidence.
Climate Change Dispatch also had an article about scientists trying to explain that heat spike in 2024 that broke temperature records around the world.
Yeah, they admitted they don't have all the answers yet. They think it's probably a mix of natural variations like El Nino and human-caused climate change.
Shows how complicated climate science is and how tough it is to say for sure that a specific weather event was caused by climate change. It also shows how important it is to keep researching to better understand these natural and human influences on our climate system.
Absolutely. Now, over to the legal side of things. The Columbia Climate School's blog talked about regulating ocean alkalinity enhancement in Washington state.
That's a new one. What is ocean alkalinity enhancement?
It's a geoengineering idea, aims to remove CO2 from the atmosphere by making seawater more alkaline.
So basically using technology to fight climate change.
Right. And Washington state is looking into how to regulate this technology because it could be beneficial, but also risky.
What are the risks?
Well, changing the chemistry of the ocean could unintentionally harm marine life and ecosystems. And there are questions about who gets to decide whether and how to use this technology, who takes the risk, and who benefits.
As we create new solutions for climate change, we need to think about the implications and put safeguards in place to make sure they're used responsibly and don't cause more harm.
I agree. We have to be cautious and talk openly about the potential good and bad of these new technologies.
Over at Climate State, they published an article about a study projecting a significant sea level rise by 2100, possibly as much as 6.2 feet.
That's worrying.
And those are conservative estimates, based on what we think greenhouse gas emissions and ice sheet melting will be in the future. If emissions keep going up at the current rate, sea levels could rise even higher.
Sea level rise is a huge threat to coastal communities and ecosystems around the world. It's going to cause erosion, flooding, and push saltwater into freshwater sources.
It's a reminder that the choices we make today will have a huge impact on the future of our planet and the lives of generations to come.
It will. And Climate State also had an article about another consequence of climate change: more rats.
Oh, yeah, what'd they say?
They reported on a study that found a big increase in urban rat populations lately, and they connect it to warmer temperatures and other effects of climate change. Warmer winters let rats breed year-round, and more of them survive, so there's more competition for resources and a higher risk of diseases spreading.
Climate change can have some surprising and unpleasant consequences, even in our cities.
Absolutely. It reminds us that we need to be prepared for all sorts of impacts, direct and indirect, and come up with ways to adapt that take care of both people and nature.
Now let's look at some solutions at the community level. Climate Dog had an article about how to get communities to fight flooding.
Oh yeah, they emphasized empowering communities to handle flooding themselves.
So what did they suggest?
They argued that community-based solutions can be more effective than top-down approaches because they're tailored to the specific needs of the community and use local knowledge and resources. They stress the importance of including residents in the decision-making and empowering them to take charge of their own safety and well-being.
It's not just about building seawalls or moving communities. It's about giving people the tools and knowledge to protect themselves and work together to find solutions that work for everyone.
Exactly. Those community-based solutions are often more sustainable and resilient because they come from local knowledge, values, and social networks.
What's happening in the world of energy?
Andy May, petrophysicist, wrote a piece about the relationship between energy and matter when it comes to climate change, looking at the science of greenhouse gases and how they absorb and re-emit radiation from the Earth's surface.
So a back-to-basics explanation of the greenhouse effect in global warming.
It is. Understanding the science of climate change is important if we're going to solve it. This article gave a clear and simple explanation of those fundamental principles.
We can get caught up in the politics and the technology, but at the end of the day, it's about physics. We need to know how energy flows on Earth and how we're changing that balance.
We do. Understanding the science helps us make smart decisions about climate policy and how we live our lives.
Let's check in with Skeptical Science for our last source today. They publish their weekly roundup of climate change news, covering everything from the impacts of climate change to policy changes, scientific research, and common misconceptions.
I like their roundups. They're a great way to stay informed about climate change. They do a great job of pulling together news and resources from all over the world and debunking those climate myths.
Let's look at a specific article from their roundup. They had a fact check about the claim that global warming is good for biodiversity.
It's important to clear that up. Some species might do well in warmer temperatures for a little while, but overall, climate change is terrible for biodiversity. It's causing habitat loss, species extinctions, and messing up ecosystems on a scale we've never seen before.
It's like saying a few weeds might grow better in a heat wave, but the whole garden is dying.
Exactly. We need to protect biodiversity, especially with climate change happening, because healthy ecosystems are essential for us. They give us food, clean water, medicine, and so much more.
Skeptical science also fact-checked the claim that more CO2 in the atmosphere is good for plants, implying that climate change might actually help agriculture.
Oh, yeah, that's another one they debunked. While plants do need CO2 for photosynthesis, there's only so much they can use. Plus, climate change brings droughts, floods, heat waves, pests, and diseases, all of which are bad for agriculture.
Complicated, right? We need to be aware of both the good and the bad of climate change and develop solutions that tackle the challenges while making the most of any benefits.
I agree. Climate change is a tough problem. But if we understand the science, talk honestly, and work together, we can find ways to create a better future for everyone.
Well said.
And speaking of collective action, the New York Times had some interesting thoughts on how LA could rebuild and become more resilient to future wildfires.
What kind of strategies are they suggesting?
Well, they're talking about going beyond just firefighting, a multifaceted approach, like stricter building codes that require fire-resistant materials, and creating more defensible space around homes by clearing vegetation, using fire-resistant landscaping, that sort of thing.
A multi-layered defense system to make communities less vulnerable. Are they looking at what other fire-prone areas are doing?
Oh, absolutely. The article mentions Australia and Portugal, places that have dealt with wildfires for a long time. They've come up with some innovative approaches to fire management and community resilience that LA could learn from. Like Australia, for example, has really strict building codes for homes in fire-prone areas, requiring ember-proof vents, metal roofing, and non-combustible materials for decks and fences.
Makes sense to learn from those who've been there, done that.
Yeah.
All right, let's switch gears to a different kind of environmental mystery. The New York Times also reported on this strange phenomenon of great white sharks washing up dead in Canada, and they've got brain swelling.
I know, right? It's a real head-scratcher for scientists. They're looking at everything from viral infections to toxins in the water.
Sounds like a real-life marine detective story.
Yeah.
What are some of the theories?
Well, one thought is that there's this new virus or bacteria affecting their nervous systems, or maybe they're getting into those harmful algal blooms that can produce toxins that build up in seafood. There's also the possibility of pollution playing a role, chemicals messing with their brain function.
So it could be a combination of things, not just one cause.
Right, and that's what makes these investigations so tricky. It takes time and a lot of analysis to figure out what's really going on. But the fact that these incredible creatures are dying like this is definitely concerning. It shows how vulnerable our oceans are.
Speaking of unusual animal encounters, the New York Times also had this story about a spotted hyena showing up in Egypt after being absent for, get this, 5,000 years.
I saw that. Pretty remarkable, isn't it? Hyenas used to be all over North Africa, but disappeared thousands of years ago. Now, this lone hyena pops up, making everyone wonder how and why it made such a long trip.
Like a blast from the past, it reminds us that nature is full of surprises. Any idea where it came from?
Scientists think it might have crossed the Sinai Peninsula from Israel or Jordan, where there are still hyena populations. Maybe habitat loss or climate change or something else is pushing animals to move into new areas, looking for food and a place to live.
It's a good reminder that animal migration patterns are always changing in response to the environment. Now let's head over to Africa, where there's a solar revolution happening. The New York Times highlighted this big effort to bring affordable solar power to millions of people across the continent.
It's a big deal, and not just for climate change. It's about tackling energy poverty and boosting economic development. Having reliable electricity is so important for education, healthcare, and creating opportunities. Solar energy provides a clean and sustainable solution that can really make a difference in people's lives.
It's a win-win, right? Meeting a basic human need while also moving towards a cleaner energy future. What makes this initiative stand out?
It's the sheer scale of it and the focus on keeping things affordable. They're using innovative financing models and working with local communities to make sure even the most remote and disadvantaged populations can access solar power. It's not just about building giant solar farms, it's about giving individuals and households the power to generate their own clean energy.
A great example of how renewable energy can drive positive change, not just for the environment, but for society and the economy as well. Let's move on to some economic news. The New York Times reported that President Trump's tariffs might be hurting the oil industry in unexpected ways.
Yeah, those tariffs on imported crude oil were supposed to protect American oil producers, but they're actually putting some American oil refineries at a disadvantage. Those refineries need imported crude oil to make certain kinds of gasoline and other products.
So it's kind of backfiring. The tariffs are hurting American companies that rely on global trade.
Exactly, and it shows how interconnected the global economy is and how tricky trade policy can be. And it could mean higher prices for consumers, you know? If refineries have to pay more for their raw materials, they'll probably pass those costs along to us at the gas pump.
A good reminder that economic policies can have unexpected consequences. Now let's stay in New York, but shift our focus to the city's congestion pricing plan. The New York Times reported that it might be having some unintended consequences in the South Bronx.
Oh, right. The plan is supposed to reduce traffic jams in Manhattan, but the article mentions some early data suggesting that it might actually be increasing traffic in the South Bronx as drivers try to avoid those tolls.
So they're just finding different routes to take.
Yeah, and that raises concerns about fairness. Are we just shifting the traffic burden to poorer neighborhoods? It shows how difficult it is to make these big policy changes in complex cities. There are always trade-offs and unintended consequences.
Makes you realize we need to be really careful when evaluating the impacts of policies and be ready to adjust them if they're not working as intended or if they're having negative impacts on certain communities.
Right, absolutely.
Speaking of policy impacts, President Trump's decision to stop climate spending is having a big impact across the country. The New York Times had a whole article about this, pointing out all sorts of projects that are being affected.
Yeah, those funding cuts are impacting a lot of different climate initiatives. Everything from fixing up homes and making them more energy efficient to building factories and renewable energy projects. And the thing is, many of these projects that are now stalled are in states that voted for Trump.
So even those communities that might not be fully on board with climate action are feeling the pinch.
Exactly. It shows how important those climate investments are for the economy. When you cut them, it can lead to job losses and economic setbacks. Climate action isn't just about protecting the environment. It's about creating economic opportunities and making our economy more sustainable and resilient.
It seems like those who are already struggling often end up bearing the brunt of these policy decisions. Now let's look at a more proactive approach to dealing with climate change. Climate Solutions put out an action alert urging people to get in touch with their lawmakers and support community resilience hubs.
Those hubs are all about providing essential services and support during emergencies, especially those made worse by climate change, like heat waves, floods, and power outages. They can offer things like cooling centers, shelter, and access to food and water. But what's really great is that they can also serve as community gathering places, even when there's no emergency, helping people connect and build that sense of shared responsibility for being prepared and resilient.
It's about being ready for what's coming and making sure communities have the resources they need, not just reducing emissions.
Exactly.
NASA's Earth Observatory shared a pretty striking image of Alaska.
I saw that. It really showed how little snow they have this winter because it's been so warm.
Yeah, you see brown mountains where there should be snow. A stark reminder of how climate change is affecting even the far reaches of our planet. And those changes, especially in the Arctic, have consequences for everyone.
Absolutely.
Melting glaciers and ice sheets contribute to rising sea levels, which threaten coastal communities all over the world.
And it messes up ecosystems and impacts indigenous communities who depend on that land and ice for their way of life.
The Indigenous Climate Hub had a really powerful piece reflecting on how climate change is impacting indigenous communities.
I read that one too. It was very moving. They talked about that deep connection indigenous people have with the land and how climate change is damaging that relationship.
Yeah, threatening their cultural heritage, their traditional way of life, their spiritual well-being. The author used this metaphor of small berries, which are important to many indigenous cultures for food and medicine.
Oh, right. I remember that.
It was a way of showing how climate change is disrupting that delicate balance of nature and affecting the things they rely on.
A powerful way to put it.
Climate change isn't just an environmental problem. It's a social justice issue, too. and it often hits marginalized communities the hardest, even though they're the least responsible for causing it.
We need to listen to those communities and include their knowledge and perspectives in our solutions.
Now, for a different take on Climate Change Dispatch had an article criticizing a study that predicted millions of heat-related deaths in Europe.
Oh, interesting. What was their criticism?
They basically said the study was flawed, used bad data, and exaggerated the potential impact, resulting in those really high numbers. They said it didn't properly account for things like adaptation, new technology, and societal changes that could reduce the impacts of heat waves.
It's good to remember that even scientists can disagree about the severity of climate change and its effects. We have to critically evaluate those findings and consider different viewpoints.
Especially with a complex issue like climate change, where there's a lot of uncertainty and conflicting information out there.
Absolutely, and we need to watch out for sensationalist reporting that tries to scare people without giving a balanced or accurate picture. Climate change is a serious threat, but we need to stay calm and rely on the facts.
Climate Change Dispatch also had an article about how scientists are having trouble explaining that heat spike in 2024 that smashed temperature records worldwide.
Oh yeah, they basically admitted they don't have all the answers yet. They think it was probably a combination of natural climate variability like El Nino and human-caused climate change.
Shows you how complex climate science is and how hard it can be to say for sure what caused a particular weather event. It also highlights how important it is to keep researching so we can better understand how natural and human influences are interacting to shape our climate.
Exactly. Now let's talk about something a bit different, the legal side of things. The Columbia Climate School's blog had a piece on how Washington State is looking into regulating ocean alkalinity enhancement.
That's a new one for me. What is ocean alkalinity enhancement?
Well, it's a geoengineering idea that involves increasing the alkalinity of seawater to remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere.
So it's using technology to fight climate change.
Right. And Washington State is trying to figure out how to regulate this technology because it could have both benefits and risks.
What kind of risks?
Well, messing with the chemistry of the ocean could have unintended consequences for marine life and ecosystems. And there are questions about who gets to decide whether and how to use this technology, who bears the risks, and who benefits.
It's a reminder that as we develop new solutions, we need to think about the consequences and put safeguards in place. We don't want to create more problems while trying to solve one.
Absolutely. We need to be cautious and have open and honest discussions about the potential pros and cons of these new technologies.
Over at Climate State, they published an article about a study that projected a significant rise in sea levels by 2100, maybe as much as 6.2 feet.
Wow, that's a lot.
And that's based on what they consider to be conservative estimates of future greenhouse gas emissions and ice sheet melting. If emissions keep rising at the rate they are now, sea levels could rise even higher.
Sea level rise is a major threat for coastal communities and ecosystems worldwide. It's going to lead to erosion, flooding, and saltwater contamination of freshwater sources.
It really highlights the impact our choices today will have on the future of our planet and the well-being of future generations.
It does. And Climate State also had an article about another consequence of climate change: more rats.
What did they say about that?
They reported on a study that found a significant increase in urban rat populations in recent years, and they linked it to warmer temperatures and other climate change effects. Basically, warmer winters allow rats to breed year-round, and more of them survive, which leads to increased competition for resources and a higher risk of diseases spreading.
Another example of how climate change can have unexpected and unpleasant side effects, even in our cities.
It is. It emphasizes the need to consider all the potential impacts of climate change, both direct and indirect, and come up with strategies that address the needs of both people and nature.
Now let's look at some community-based solutions. Climate Dog had an article about ways to get communities involved in fighting flooding.
Oh yeah, they stress the importance of empowering communities to tackle flooding risks themselves.
So what were their suggestions?
They argued that community-based solutions are often more effective than top-down approaches because they're tailored to the specific needs of the community and utilize local knowledge and resources. They really emphasize getting residents involved in decision-making and empowering them to take ownership of their own safety and well-being.
It's not just about building massive seawalls or relocating whole communities. It's about giving people the tools and knowledge to protect themselves and work together to find solutions that work for them.
Absolutely. Those community-based solutions tend to be more sustainable and resilient in the long run because they're grounded in local knowledge, values, and social networks.
Let's dive into the world of energy. Andy May, petrophysicist, wrote an article about the relationship between energy and matter in the context of climate change.
Oh, yeah. He focused on the fundamental science behind greenhouse gases and how they work, absorbing and re-emitting radiation from the Earth's surface.
It's going back to basics with the greenhouse effect and global warming.
It is. It's crucial to understand the science if we're going to develop effective solutions. The article explained those fundamental principles in a clear and concise way.
Sometimes we get caught up in the political debates and the technological solutions, but at its core, climate change is a matter of physics. We need to grasp how energy flows on Earth and how our actions are altering that balance.
Absolutely. A solid understanding of the science is essential for making informed decisions about climate policy and the choices we make in our daily lives.
For our final source today, let's check out Skeptical Science. They released their weekly roundup of climate change news, covering a broad range of topics, from the impacts of climate change to policy developments, scientific research, and those common misunderstandings about climate change.
I always appreciate their roundups. They're a great way to stay up to date on all things climate change. They do a fantastic job of gathering news and resources from around the world and debunking those climate myths that circulate.
They do. Let's delve into one specific article from their roundup. They published a fact check addressing the claim that global warming is actually beneficial for biodiversity.
It's important to set the record straight on that one. While a few species might experience a temporary boost from warmer temperatures, the overall impact of climate change on biodiversity is overwhelmingly negative. We're seeing habitat loss, species extinctions, and disruptions to ecosystems on a scale that's unprecedented in human history.
It's like saying that a few weeds might thrive during a heat wave, but the entire garden is suffering.
Exactly. It underscores the importance of safeguarding biodiversity in the face of climate change. We have to recognize that healthy ecosystems are crucial for our own well-being. They provide us with food, clean water, medicine, and countless other benefits.
There was another fact check from Skeptical Science I wanted to mention.
Which one was that?
It was about the claim that higher carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere are good for plants, suggesting that climate change might actually be a boon for agriculture.
Yes, that's another common misconception that they effectively debunked. While it's true that plants need CO2 for photosynthesis, there's a limit to how much they can benefit from increased levels. On top of that, climate change is creating a whole host of other problems for agriculture, like those more frequent and intense droughts, floods, and heat waves, not to mention the spread of pests and diseases.
It's a complex issue, and we can't just focus on one aspect while ignoring the others. We need to look at the bigger picture and develop strategies that address the challenges while maximizing any potential benefits.
I agree. Climate change is a complex problem. But if we understand the science, engage in honest and open discussions, and work together, we can find solutions that lead to a more sustainable and resilient future for everyone.
Yeah, it's definitely a lot to take in. Seems like we're all trying to figure things out in this changing world, from those resilient folks in LA and their pets to the scientists grappling with the complexities of climate change.
And that's what makes these deep dives so important, right? We're not just absorbing information, we're trying to make sense of it all together.
What stood out to you today? Anything that surprised you or really caught your attention?
That story about the hyena showing up in Egypt after 5,000 years was pretty wild. It's like nature's way of saying, hey, I've still got some tricks up my sleeve, even with all the changes we're causing.
Makes you wonder what other unexpected things we might see as climate change keeps reshaping the world. Maybe more animals moving into new areas, forming new relationships, adapting in ways we haven't even thought of.
Yeah, it's a reminder that nature is constantly evolving, and we need to be ready for the unexpected.
On that note of embracing the unknown, it's time for us to wrap up this deep dive.
Thanks for joining us today, everyone. We hope you've gained some valuable insights from our exploration of the news.
Remember, staying informed is the first step towards making a difference. What will you do today to make a positive impact, even if it's something small?
We'll be back tomorrow to dive into more news. Until then, keep those brains buzzing and keep exploring.